Good afternoon. This is Matthew Vance again with the Holiness Heritage Sunday School Literature. And we're on lesson 13 of our current quarter, the last lesson for May the 30th, 2021. Boy, I tell you what, time has flown by. It seemed like Y2K when it rolled over to the year 2000 was just a year or two ago. Time has moved on, and we've all got a little older, and hopefully maybe a little wiser. I don't know. But our lesson today is titled No Name Heroes, and for the last few weeks, last 12 weeks, we've been studying about just some random character studies throughout the Bible. And today we've got about 3 or 4 that we're going to hit under these no-name heroes. These are people who have exhibited heroic characteristics but are almost totally unknown. And in the Bible there are many unnamed heroes. So our golden text, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27, "But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty." All right, we're going to read from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 40, and then 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 31. So Hebrews 11:35, "Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." And then we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26. "For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. But of him are ye in Christ Jesus, whom of God is made unto us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that according as it is written, he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord." Well, in the last few weeks, we've really studied a lot of characters that have been godly examples. We've studied some that were examples of conduct that we definitely ought to avoid. But they're real people with names and examples from the Word of God. But today we want to look at some no-name heroes. Some people that we don't know their name, we don't know the tribe thereof, we don't know their family. In fact, we know very little about them at all. But God put them in His Word to give us an example. We want to remind all of us, every person, that God knows about us and is aware of our character and our deeds and the things that we do, even when we are unknown to the world. And you know, the world we live in is just, celebrities are what matter. If you're a celebrity, the showman, the entertainer, the big name. Of course, with Hollywood, and things of that nature. The best known, the sports heroes, the movie stars, the things that the ones that are popular, the personality, the entertainers. Well, you know what? God, I really believe, looks at us and realizes a little bit foolish that we're more interested in celebrities than we are Christ, and more interested in Hollywood than we are the Holy Ghost. God has used men and women. Some have become very well known. I'm thinking just yesterday I was listening to an old message from back in the 1900s. How about that? Boy, it seems like a long time ago. Back in the 1900s, from Joey Height preaching a message. And a lot of people know Joey Height. And he was a pulpiteer. He knew how to keep a crowd, their attention, and how to get the message across. But I wonder how many have been just as anointed or been just as good of a preacher that just didn't have the name. And that's not by no means anything disrespectful to Brother Height. Thank God he had that, and a lot of people would go hear him because of that. And a lot of people have got saved or have got touched because of that. But how many have there been that have not had the big name, but they were faithful to God? Here in Hebrews chapter 11, it's called, a lot of people call it the Hall of Faith. Abraham, Moses, Noah, Gideon, Samson, Samuel, David, Sarah, Rahab, different ones that are mentioned. But here at the end of chapter 11, in verses 33 on down, there's some others whose names we do not know, but their exploits are mentioned. The women received their dead raised to life. Others tortured, not accepting deliverance. Some that went through bonds and imprisonment, stoned, sawn asunder, tempted, of whom the world was not worthy. Hold on just a second, folks. I'm sorry. Of whom the world wasn't worthy. Those of whom the world, they were unknown. They were not somebody that was named or popular, but they were somebody who lived for God, somebody who had been faithful to God and had served God throughout their life. And we got 4 examples that we want to talk about. Number 1, we want to talk about heroic faith. In 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a woman that is not named. She is simply known as a Shunammite. She is from that region, and then she was named by where she was from. That would be just like saying that preacher is an American or a Virginian. That preacher, she was just a Shunammite. Nobody knows her name. Nobody recorded it in the Word of God. But here is a woman who had heroic faith. We remember the story that her and her husband had built a small room at their house where the prophet Elisha could stay as he traveled around. He could come and stay at their house. And when Elisha wanted to know what reward she wanted for her kindness and hospitality, she said, "Nothing, I'm content with life as it is." But as Gehazi and Elisha were talking it over, Gehazi mentioned that she had no children. And Elisha told her that God was going to give her a son. And even though maybe she might have found it hard to believe at first, it came to pass. And no doubt her and her husband loved this son dearly. They had probably given up hope on having children. I thought they would never have their own. And so God gave them this child. And as time went by, this child was out working in the field and trying to be like Dad. And my dad, those of you that know my dad, know that he's always been a hard worker. And I can remember as just a child, and you may think this is a little foolish, but I can remember as just a child, my dad pastored a church, but hard to make enough money. Pastored a small church and had a large family, 8 of us children. So with mom and dad, there were 10. And I can remember his dad would do carpenter work and a lot of mechanic work. And I can remember watching him with gasoline in a can and washing parts. He pulled a motor apart and he's cleaning the oil off with some gasoline, and his hands would get chapped. And I can remember seeing my dad as his hands were rough and cracked open and chapped. And I can remember as a little boy going into the bathroom and washing my hands and not drying them and leaving the water on my hands until my hands would become chapped. And I remember that my hands, there were times that they cracked and bled, and I was so proud of that because I was just like my dad. I know that may sound silly, but your children are watching you. And this little boy was out working with dad in the field. And out there in the field, he got a pain in his head. They took him to his mother, and there he sat on her lap until he died. Can you imagine this woman? Can you imagine what she's going through? The anguish in her soul. What would she do with this calamity? Would she mourn and cry and bury the promise of God and resign herself to no children and even maybe getting bitter and getting hurt at God that gave her this child? But that's not the way this woman was. I don't know her name. God never told us her name. But she was a woman of heroic faith. As she took him, put him in Elisha's bedchamber, and put him on the bed. And then she calmly goes out and starts making preparation to go see the man of God. She felt like in her heart, that if God had given her this son, that God could bring the child back. But how many, I wonder, have experienced a tragedy, had a problem, had something happen, and they run from God, and they run from God's house, and they run from God's people. But I want to tell you, the same God that helped you the last time is the same God that can help you again. When you get in trouble, when you have heartache, when you have problems, you ought to run to God. Run to God's house. Run to God's men. Run to God's people. Run to God's arms. There are times that people go to blaming God for things that happen, for things that the devil has done, things the devil has caused, and they blame God for that, when it was the devil all behind it. And why in the world would you turn your back on God and go and join the devil, which is the one that caused the tragedy and the heartache in the first place? But do like this woman did, as she turned and she went to the man of God, as she went to God, as she went to serve God. She came near Elisha, sent Gehazi to meet her. Gehazi said, "Is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child?" And this woman said, "It is well." There's a preacher one time that said this woman lied because it wasn't well. That child was dead. She lied about that. No. She wasn't lying, because in her heart she believed that it was going to be all right. In her heart, she knew that God, that is the heroic faith. This wasn't some name and claim it, blab it and grab it, some silly, but she really had a faith in God. And she looked at that and said, "It shall be well." And I thought myself, how many times I wish I could have had that kind of faith. What's bigger, your troubles or your God? What is more important, your troubles or your God? And sometimes in times of trouble, it seems like God is off or God is distant. And it feels like but God is still bigger than your problems. And this woman, had such a heroic faith as she told the man of God. Elisha came, prayed, stretched himself on the child, got up, came back and did it again, and then took him up, and the child lived, and he took him to his mother. We don't know the mother's name. We don't know the child's name. We don't know anything about them. But I believe in heaven, there in Hebrews chapter 11, when it said women received their dead, raised to life again, I wonder if it was talking about this Shunammite woman, a no-name hero, one who lived for God, one who was faithful to God. Let's look at another one. In 2 Kings chapter 5, let's look at a heroic testimony. A young servant girl had been taken captive by the Syrians. We don't know if her parents had been killed. Quite likely they had been killed. She had been taken in the battle as she was made a servant to the wife of Naaman, the captain of the host. Life had given her a harsh blow. Life had not dealt good with her as she was in a foreign land surrounded by heathens and idolaters that didn't worship the true God, surrounded by strange customs, surrounded by unknown circumstances and situations. But let's look at this girl. How would she respond? Would she become bitter against God? How would she say, God, why didn't you stop it? God, if you really cared about me, you wouldn't have let this happen. God, if you're just concerned about me, if you're really a God in heaven, why didn't you stop it? But that's not what she did. She didn't bow to the pressure around her. She didn't turn her back on her God and begin to serve the heathen God and join that heathen lifestyle. But she lived faithfully for God. Without the support of godly parents, without the support of godly friends, without a priest in a temple, without a pastor, without a prophet, she continued to live for God. Now, I believe in going to church. I believe you ought to go to church. I believe if you're not attending church, you got something wrong with you. You need to go to church. But I say shame on some of us, because if we could not go to church, would we still be able to live for God like this girl did? Would we cave into the pressure of the world, the peer pressure? Would we allow the world around us force us into conforming to the world around us? Or would we stay faithful to God? This girl's heroic testimony was that all by herself, with nobody around, she continued to live for God. Not only did she live for Him, but she testified about Him. She testified about Him. Stories told of a man that was working at a job that was notorious for having being hard to work around. They made fun of Christians, and notoriously difficult place for a Christian to work. And guy got a job there and made it a couple years. And somebody said something about how have you made it there? He said, well, they just don't know I'm a Christian. They don't know I'm a Christian. I had some lumber delivered one time to a house. And when it was delivered, I said something to the delivery guy about somebody, mutual acquaintance that we both knew. And I was telling him about this guy. And I said something about him being a preacher. And that fellow looked at me and said, I have known him for 12 years. I never knew he was a preacher. I never knew he was a preacher. Well, you know what that girl did? She tells Naaman's wife, if he could get to the God of Israel, if he could get to the prophet of Israel, there's somebody there that could help him. And you know the story. The message got to Naaman. Naaman went there. The prophet didn't come out the door, just told him to go wash in the Jordan River. Naaman goes away angry, but finally goes to the river, and he washes and is made clean, and he goes back home. Well, you know what? That was because of the heroic testimony of somebody who said, I'm going to live for God no matter what happens. I'm going to be faithful to God no matter what problems I face, no matter what troubles. And I want to challenge somebody here tonight. You may be going through a heartache. You may be going through the hardest place in your life. But I want to challenge somebody to stay faithful to God. Keep your testimony with God. Continue to live for God. And see what God will do for you. We don't know who that little girl is. We don't know what her name is. She's a no-name hero. We don't have a clue about that little girl. But you know what? That little girl stayed faithful to God. Number 3, let's look at heroic kindness. Let's look at, I recently got involved in a circumstance where I felt a young lady was in danger. Me and my wife driving up the road. There's a car. I thought he was going to run over her. We got involved, tried to rescue her, tried to get her away. And somebody said, why would you, just don't get involved. Don't get involved. That's a good way to get hurt. Don't get involved. But how about the story in Luke chapter 10 about an unnamed hero of kindness? Jesus tells about a man going from down to Jericho, fell among thieves. They beat him up, took all he had, left him laying in a ditch beside the road. Before long, a priest came by. He gets around as quickly as he can. There's thieves in the area. I better hurry. A Levite looks at him, goes on by. But the Bible said there came a man who's only identified by his race. He was just a Samaritan. He was from the city of Samaria. He was part of the tribe. The Samaritans were some Jews that had married with some of the local tribes and were half-breeds and had become the tribe, the family of the Samaritans. He was just like everybody else that came by. The same thieves could be waiting in the rocks to surprise him that beat this man by. This man could have easily said, it's none of my business. I'm going to go on my way. I'm too busy. I don't have time. But here's a no-name hero. The Bible said he had compassion on him. He looked at him and said, what would I want somebody to do if it was me in that state? What would I want somebody to do if it was me that was laying there beaten and bruised and dying? What would I want somebody to do to me? And he realized I'd want somebody to love me. I'd want somebody to look at me with eyes of love. He said, I want somebody that would care enough. The Bible said that he went to him. He went to where he was. He went and came. And, it's one thing just to love people, but it's another thing to go to where they are. It's another for Christian kindness, heroic kindness, to reach out and help someone, some other person, some Christian, someone that's not even saved, someone that's needy, someone that needs help. Are we willing to reach out to them? Are we willing to help them? In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 17, but whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother hath need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion for him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? Now I want you to notice this was a brother. This is somebody new. This was somebody maybe right in the church family, but he had a need, not a want. This wasn't that he needed to spend his money on a new four-wheeler and couldn't pay his rent. This wasn't somebody that went on a cruise or vacation and then didn't have enough food to feed their family. But this was somebody with a need. But then it said, if you have this world's goods, you don't need $1 million. But he had enough to help this guy. He had enough to reach out. And then if you refuse to meet that, you shut up your wallet. You shut up your bowels of compassion. The Bible said, how dwelleth the love of God within you. I'll tell you, words of love don't mean anything until you're willing to back them up. Words of love don't mean anything until you're willing to do something about it. And this man went to where he was. He took care of him. He bound up his wounds. I put him on his beast, took him to an inn, and paid. Said, if take care of him, and if there's anything else, I'll pay it when I get back. Don't you notice Jesus not only commended his kindness, but he commanded it when he said, go and do thou likewise. And here is a heroic kindness that is demonstrated by another no-name hero. We don't know who he is, but he showed kindness. Can you say the same about you? Can you say the same? And then number 4, this will be our last one. A heroic generosity. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus went down to the temple, sitting watching the treasury box and watching how much people gave. Jesus was watching. You know, some people use the verse, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing, to, as an excuse for pitiful giving, or I want anybody to know. But Jesus was saying, you just don't need to make a show of it, but you still ought to give. You shouldn't give to receive honor of men. But he watches. He's watching the offering. He watched the offering in church this morning. He knows who's robbing God. He knows when a real sacrifice is really being made. And as Jesus watched, a lot of rich folks came by, put a lot of money in. Took other, it's not hard to give $100 when you got 100,000. It's not hard to give 1,000 when you got 1,000,000. They gave large amounts, but then comes this woman with 2 little mites, about 4 cents worth. It's all she had. Would she walk out with them clenched in her hand, making some excuse why she couldn't afford to give? Why that's all she had, and that's all she could ever give? I want to tell you something. I found out when you give sacrificially. Richard Warmbrand, in his book Tortured for Christ, said that when they were in prison, they were given 1 slice of bread a week, and then every day they would get a dirty little soup and get 1 slice of bread a week. And they decided that they would tithe. And they kept track of it, and every 10th week they took their slice of bread and gave it to a weaker brother, gave it to somebody who was struggling, who was suffering, and they gave it to them as their tithe to the master. That's a sacrifice. This woman wanted to give to God. She wanted to give, and she gave sacrificially. She gave even when it hurt. And God looked at her and said, she's given more than them all. She's done more than all of them. I'll tell you a little story. Years ago, I was pastoring out in Oklahoma, and one of the neighboring churches was going to have a revival. And the evangelist they were having, I'll be honest, I wasn't real fond of him. I'd known him for years. I knew some things about him, and I just wasn't fond of him. And I was going to go to church. They're having a youth rally Friday night, and I fellowshipped with this church. So I was going to go and be in service with them. And before I left that day, that afternoon, God got to dealing with me. And he said, I want you to give that evangelist tonight $100. And I didn't want to give that evangelist $100. I just didn't want to do it. God said, I want you to give him $100. And I had about $600 saved up. We were going to try to go on vacation. I had been saving for vacation. Had about $600 saved up, and I said, Lord, I don't have an extra $100. I don't have $100 to give. And so I made up my mind I was going to give him $20 that night. I was going to put $20 in the offering. We got in our van, me and my family. We headed up the road. Got about 10, 15 minutes from home, and the transmission went out in my van. I had to get it towed in. Had to get a new transmission. The $600 I told God I didn't have enough of, it cost that. Plus I had to borrow another $300 to get the transmission fixed that I had to end up paying back. And I never told my wife for a long time what was going on. And finally I told her. I said, you know why that transmission went out? I had already made up my mind I wasn't going to give him that $100. And I was going to give $20. Well, I paid for it and paid dearly. This was in the fall. The next year, June, Bristow camp meeting. I'm sitting in Bristow camp meeting. And, of course, when the van broke down, we never went to revival that night at all. Couldn't get there. And I'm sitting there, though, 8 or 9 months later, Bristow camp meeting. And that evangelist walks in and sits down behind me. And God told me, you never did give him that $100. You never did. And this time I really, really was broke. I didn't have $100 anywhere in the world. I literally did not have $100. In fact, I had enough money in my wallet that we could get a hamburger down the concession stand. And I already had enough gas in my van. We were driving home in the morning. We'd spend that night. And first thing in the morning, we would drive home. Maybe we could drive home that night. I can't remember. But I had enough gas to get home and just a few dollars to get a hamburger for my kids. And I didn't have $100. Didn't have it in the bank. Didn't have it in savings. Didn't have it anywhere. And I remember saying, but God, I don't have it. Yes, Lord. I'll give him $100. And I leaned over to my wife and I said, I'm fixing to go get $100 to give this preacher back there. And she said, honey, we don't have $100 anywhere. And I said, I know, but I can't afford a motor in my car. I've already put a transmission in over this. I can't afford a motor in my car. So I knew I had a line of credit at the bank. And I knew I could call and transfer $100, borrow $100. So I told my wife, I'm going to go to the room. We're staying on the grounds. I'm going to go to the room. I'm going to get my checkbook. I'm going to write him a $100 check. And there's no way he can get that check cashed. I don't believe in writing faith checks. If you ain't got money in the bank, don't write a faith check. But I didn't have it, but I knew I could borrow it. And so I went to the room, got the checkbook. To get the checkbook, I headed down the aisle. And as I got to the back row of the Bristow camp meeting, somebody said, Brother Vance, it's so good to see you. And reached out and shook my hand. And when I pulled my hand back there, lay a $100 bill. I never went to the room. I never went and got the checkbook. I just took it, slipped it in my pocket, thanked him, walked up by that evangelist. As I walked by, I dropped that $100 bill in his lap, said, Lord bless you, brother. And I learned that day to obey God. I learned that day to give, even if it hurt, even if it was sacrificial. By God's grace, I don't believe I've ever made that same mistake again. I've learned to give. I've learned to help. I've learned to do something for God, to give. And this woman, we've preached about her. We've talked about her. She gave more than they all. Thousands of preachers have used her for a sermon illustration. A no-name hero that learned heroic generosity. Learned to give to God. And you know what? You may never be anybody important. I will never be anybody important. When I die, the world will never miss me. When I die, probably most of the church world will really never miss me. I know that, but you know what? If I can please God, if I can be faithful to God, that's what's going to matter. I want to be one of those no-name heroes that's willing to obey God. I want to have that heroic faith, that heroic testimony, that heroic kindness, and that heroic generosity. And maybe someday I'll be able to affect somebody else for the gospel. Thank you very much. Lord bless you. You have a good day. We'll see you next Sunday. Got a new quarter starting, so we'll get started on that next Sunday.